your time on this President's Day, so we appreciate it. And as our participants are converging, Alison, do you think we should give them maybe 1-2 more minutes to see?
Yeah, I just figure updates.
Eliot, if fine with you, maybe 1 to 3 minutes.
That's fine. Absolutely.
Very good.
Make sure I think everybody can hear us. We'll allow them to have access to speak after we're through the presentation, but they can do some chats.
Yep.
Prefer chat over the Q&A, but I'll keep my eye on the Q&A in case somebody does pop in and is having difficulty with the chat feature.
And you see me chuckling off, I guess, stage left. Maybe you're right, my left. So behind me in the mudroom, the cat is up on the table, on the laundry table eating dinner, and the Maltese is like hanging out around tactically. He's like positioned around the corner. He's just waiting for her to come up the stairs so he can go in.
We have been there, right, with my students when we have meetings. So the cat will decide to just be between them and the camera, and
yeah.
But we are animal friendly here, so
fantastic. Yeah. I introduced him on my one slide, just give you a sense of what you might hear in the background here.
We had that. We had a summer short course last time that had to be because of COVID. It would have been residential because it's as you can see, we are in a nice the state and the country and things. We like to invite everybody over for us, including our typically online students, otherwise online students. But obviously last summer, and we were in COVID mode, and we did that remote via Zoom for a week, and we had an opportunity to meet a lot of our faculty and students and pets, and that was actually nice. It was a nice.
Yeah, that's not too bad.
I'll say now we are 10 altogether. I think some will still continue to come in, but out of respect, for everybody's time and as a courtesy to Eliot, maybe I can start, and then Alison, because this is just apologize for the technical suggestions, but this is the first time that you are the first speaker in our series. So in terms of housekeeping, Alison, I would probably do the welcome and then over to you for a few housekeeping items, if students can use chat or not. And then I'll also say that I think we set aside 1 hour, right? And Eliot, I'll leave it up to the speaker how they want to divide that, how long they would like to present or speak, and then become interactive, or do presentation in different steps and become interactive in between. And then what you prefer, if students speak up or if they should leave their questions on the chat, and then Alison or I can read them out, whatever works best. Wonderful. So I get started, and here I am. Hello, everybody. Thank you for taking the time today. Happy President's Day, first of all. So thank you for giving of your time. We understand it's a federal holiday, but Penn State is a public land-grant university, and we have a lot of students and instructors who have dual careers and also work in a federal capacity. So happy President's Day, and thank you for taking the time. I hope you have been able to enjoy the day. And it's great to see you here. So as you probably know, I'm Alexander Siedschlag. I am Penn State's Chair of Homeland Security. And I believe on your screen to the left is Alison Shuler, who is my program coordinator, and is also always excited and there to help with a little bit co-curricular events. And this is one of those. This is the first event in our spring Homeland Security speaker series. We have had speaker series before, but this one is particular for a couple of reasons, including that we really look to bring back Penn State graduates who have had their careers, like Eliot, whom I'm going to introduce in a minute, and are interested to sharing some of their insights on relevant Homeland Security topics with our students. Then second, this is a trusted, I call it trusted Penn State Homeland Security family community event, because this is not a publicly advertised event, because we consciously want to limit it to our trusted community, because sometimes speakers then are able to address, the topic in a different way than they would have been able to address the topic in an openly published event and things. And also we want to demonstrate the added value that you all have as a part of that community. And Penn State Homeland Security means These events are open to current students, also our students from friendly programs such as the Master of International Affairs or the Master of Business Administration, who follow and are admitted to our Homeland Security concentrations within their master's programs. Then obviously our very own World Campus Homeland Security Masters and Graduate Certificate students across the number of collaborating colleges. Then also our alumni. And last but not least, members of our chapter, of our Penn State chapter that we are very proud of in the National Honor Society Order of the Sword and Shield, or Omicron Sigma Sigma. So that is the context. And as I said before, we'll leave it up to each speaker to determine how they would like to divide up the session. If they would like, to present for a certain amount of time, and then, how much of the rest of the time they would like to leave for questions and answers and things like that. But Alison, I'm sure Alison has a plan. I'll ask her to share that in a minute. But I would take just a moment to welcome back Eliot Schmidt to his alma mater. Great to have you here tonight, Eliot, and thanks for joining and for agreeing to kick off this speaker series. That is also specific and particular as another additional aspect, because it's sponsored by our Homeland Security Advisory Council that we have here at Penn State for our program. So the Advisory Council recommended it and sponsors it also by making their own expertise available or by recommending appropriate expertise. So this is a very special series for a couple of reasons, as you can see. But Eliot Schmidt is with the Department of Justice, and he's going to speak to us tonight on the topic on convergence of cybersecurity and risk management. Eliot is a mission resilience specialist and policy analyst with experience in cybersecurity, organizational risk management, physical security, continuity of operations, and public health preparedness. As you see, that also spans a couple of option domains within our program here at Penn State. He graduated from Penn State in 2008 with a double major in international politics and in sociology. He was recruited for SRA International, which is now part of General Dynamics Information Technology, from a PSU career fair in his senior year. He worked for a number of federal, state, and local customers over the years that included USDA, DHS, FEMA, New York City Department of Health, and the US Senate Sergeant at Arms, before joining the Department of Justice as a consultant in 2015 and converting to a federal employee in 2019. And with that, can I just give the floor very briefly to you, Alison, for a few housekeeping items, and then with that, it will be over to you, Eliot. Thanks so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Again, as Dr. Siedschlag mentioned, I'm Alison Shuler, the program coordinator. I'd like to thank Eliot and then some folks in at DOJ for allowing him to be the first of our series. He jumped on to my call, and I was happy that he was willing to do this new series that we're starting. Just want to remind you, we are recording the video, as a lot of folks aren't able to come to a live session. We'll then be able to allow them to see the presentation afterwards. This is in a webinar format, so I have you all sitting in the attendee mode. So it will be easier if you have questions during the presentation to use the chat versus the Q&A. Although I'm watching the Q&A, it just would be more live and on time that I see it in the chat feature. And if you're patient with us, either we'll hold it to the end or I'll interrupt Eliot if it's pressing, and we'll ask him then. And I know I have one question from Griffin that I've already sent over to Eliot, so we'll make sure we get your question in there.
Yep.
Last thing is that if you want to use the raised hand feature, I'll also watch that. Otherwise, at the end of the session, when Eliot goes into Q&A, I'll try to get you into the mode where you can ask your question personally. That's all I have. So Eliot, if you want to go ahead, we're
all right.
Happy.
Oh, there he goes. Perfect. All right. Let me know when you can see that. Should be sharing the presentation now. Uh-oh. We good?
Yep, you want to go back to, you ended your
Oh,
show.
all right. Good, good. I got real nervous there. I thought I
Yeah,
muted
no.
myself. All right, here we go. All right. Thank you guys both for the introductions. It's great to be back, even virtually, among the Penn State community. Thank you for the great introduction, Dr. Siedschlag and Alison. Thank you guys for hosting me. Talk about convergence. I ran into the team here from the Penn State Homeland Security Studies program at the Disaster Recovery International Conference or no, I'm sorry, it was the International Association of Emergency Managers. I try to attend both every year. IAEM happens in the fall generally, and DRI generally happens in the spring. So I wandered into the booth and asked how I could get more involved, and here we are. So this has been great. Thank you guys very much. And among a number of topics that we had kind of thrown around as potentials, the one that kind of stuck out as a good area to do a webinar on is the subject of, I'll call it convergence here, but you might also hear of it as, interdisciplinary risk management, intersectionality. That's one of the problems that we have here that we'll get into as we go along is that, a lot of different terminology being thrown around to try and get to the same point. So if I could, and I don't know if you guys want to plug this into the chat, I was just curious to get to know the audience a little bit. I'm going to stop my screen share real quick and just get, if I could get a sense of where folks are from, what the majors or people's professional backgrounds might be. That would be great.
You read my mind, Eliot. I just asked via the chat our participants to drop a line or two introducing themselves to you that way as a courtesy and also for awareness. So please go ahead, participants, and do that.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yes, great. So as Alison mentioned, we did get one question already earlier today on sort of the public health side, but I was just hoping to get a sense of, are folks mostly private industry? Dr. Siedschlag mentioned federal sector. Obviously, that's mostly my background. Just kind of curious to know. So I'll give folks a couple seconds, 30 seconds to a minute here to populate the chat. See what kind of group we've got here today. There goes the cat. Fantastic. Wanted to get that. Also wanted to get the cat dog situation out of the way before we really kick things off. All right. All right. Thank you, Griffin. Industrial engineering, risk management, quality control. Very good. Okay. IT sysadmin. All right. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Counterterrorism focus. All right. I don't think I'm allowed to say go Hawkeyes in this forum, but thank you, Iowa. Appreciate that. Okay, this is good. All right, this is good. This is good diversity here. Doctoral candidate, public administration. Oh, excellent. All right. PEMA headquarters, fantastic. All right, state emergency manager, fantastic. Couple cybersecurity folks, great. Okay, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. We'll try and get you guys, give ourselves an opportunity to hear your voices here at the end. I'm going to go back to the presentation here. I tried this out, with my wife over the weekend. So as I pontificated there, it took about a half an hour. I'll try and keep it shorter than that. As questions arise, like I said, feel free to drop them in the chat there. We'll try and get to them as we go. And I'll pause after each of the kind of big buckets. There's probably 3 big buckets in the presentation. So kind of want to what do we want to walk away from this presentation? Because this is huge, right? Almost every slide on here is probably worthy of a webinar all on its own. Not that I could do them all. I'm not a subject matter expert in all things risk, but as we kind of went over in my bio, I've been exposed to a lot of the various risk disciplines in my travels as an emergency management consultant there. So I want to talk a little bit about what the enterprise means, right? Because we talk about enterprise risk management. So what enterprise are we managing risk for? That's a big piece of it. My primary background is in physical security and information security. The financial sector, though, it is a huge player in risk management. And for them, there's whole standards. I'm sure there's a whole class on that in the business department. And then we'll get to kind of the convergence and some of the metrics that we've tracked that I track in my job now. So I kind of want to be able to have folks walk away with three things. Number one, an understanding of some of the key inputs that cybersecurity can provide to business and risk management. Number two, the necessity really at this point in time of integrating cyber risk into broader risk management. And just kind of a starting point for how you track down more of this if it's not currently integrated. So this has pretty much already been covered, but I just wanted to give you guys a sense of who you might hear in the background. I have a German Shepherd and a Maltese that generally hang out underfoot more often than not. And then I've got a COVID baby here at home. She's going to be 8 months next week, and she's taken after her old man there, wandering around the neighbor's house with a bucket on her head. So no need to go back into all of this. That was already pretty well covered. And I did just want to mention, this was hilarious to me when I was in college, but in my role as an IT policy analyst, this is actually a career field. The ability to take what the engineers say and translate it into customer speak, and take the customer requirements and translate that back down into what the engineers need to do is a discipline unto itself. In my office at the Department of Justice, there's a headquarters element, and then there are all the branches and divisions that you all are probably familiar with: Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Bureau of Prisons, Drug Enforcement Administration. The various attorneys are split into various groups. There's civil, there's criminal, there's environmental and national resource, there's national security. So all of these different groups, in many cases, have unique information technology infrastructure, and they, in many cases, have systems that they operate that are unique to their environments. So in my staff, and it's not officially my staff, we operate under the DOJ Chief Information Security Officer, but we've got a team of 4 feds, and we're back up to about 10 contractors now who serve as the cybersecurity policy liaisons out to those components. And we're able to kind of take the mission impact of cybersecurity requirements back up from the components to departmental policy, and also translate departmental policy down into what we require of the components in order to implement that. So it's a little bit of kind of the professional background on my end. So anyway, back to what is the enterprise, right? So risk management can mean something different depending on the discipline that you're operating in or the enterprise that you're attempting to manage it for. So I'll use the example of Penn State itself here, right? Massive enterprise at the top tier level. We're talking, I counted as about 24 campuses. I know there's 19 Commonwealth campuses plus U Park. But then you have Hershey, Dickinson School of Law, the Technology Campus in Williamsport, Great Valley here. So so you could look at enterprise risk management across the university as a whole. And if that is your scope, you have 24 campuses, over 100,000 individuals. You have individuals who have traveled, in the before times, and hopefully soon here in the after times as well. After COVID, you'll have folks traveling, study abroads. So, if you're looking at enterprise risk management for the university as a whole, you may have to consider the geopolitical risk of a study abroad trip in Jordan or East Africa or South America, right? There's a lot to consider when we're talking about all the inputs that could feed enterprise risk. If you're looking at the School of Medicine in Hershey, right, there's potential radiological elements involved in the X-ray machines. There's HIPAA considerations along with personally identifiable information for patient records, research trials, things of that nature. So, a physical enterprise, an information technology enterprise, a human resources enterprise, on top of or building to the organization itself. And depending on what enterprise you are looking at, there are any number of handbooks, frameworks, methodologies that can be applied. The ISO 31000 series comes to mind. There's a section in the project management handbook about risk management. On the physical security side, there's threat hazard identification and risk assessment. If you're just talking about the buildings themselves, there are various facility security levels that are published by the Interagency Security Committee. Within the financial sector, you've got the COSO framework. And then folks on the IT side should be familiar at this point with NIST and the RMF and the CSF, but we'll get into a little bit more about that as we go along here. Any questions at this point, Alison, or good to move on? Pretty high level so far.
Good to move on.
All right. So my background primarily, I started in physical security, but I was part of a team doing physical security assessments for the USDA Forest Service Chief Information Officer. So my very first contract was a business impact analysis, and the enterprise as defined there was USDA Forest Service IT nationwide. So they have 11 regional offices. They have over a dozen research stations, mostly affiliated with universities in various states. So, they have the headquarters in DC and all these field offices and things like that. So it was our job essentially from the standpoint of the Forest Service executive management to go out and help them get an understanding of, what their IT presence was. Had anything been homegrown out in the regions or the research stations that they perhaps weren't tracking, and what was their state of readiness, right? What was their enterprise resilience essentially at that point? So we did initial inventory, business impact analysis, physical security assessment in concert with the federal law enforcement entities that protected their facilities, mostly in the regional offices were all federal buildings, so Homeland Security officers in those areas. And interestingly enough, the Forest Service has its own law enforcement officers that predominantly go out and police the national forest, do a lot of drug interdiction. So that was kind of an interesting, I hadn't known that before I started. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, we'll come back up here. At a high level, the physical security risk assessment at a national level, I guess I should say, originally we called it threat hazard identification and risk assessment. It is now the National Risk and Capabilities Assessment. And that sort of change in terminology came after the 2017 hurricane and wildfire season. There was a new law passed called the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act of 2018. emergency management is an interesting field. I think probably once a decade, we have a particularly bad year in terms of the scale of the emergencies, and a new law is passed. So for the longest time, it was just the Stafford Act. Obviously, 2005, we had Hurricane Katrina. After Katrina, there was a new law passed to kind of try and bolster emergency preparedness, emergency response capabilities. We started looking at whole of community response. Post-Katrina, we started looking at capabilities assessments. And now the Disaster Recovery Reform Act places a little bit more emphasis on those capability targets. So it still starts with threat hazard identification, and then the risk assessment in the it should be the NRCA. The risk assessment there is the capability gap. So we start with 59 distinct threats and hazards. We down selected that to 7 scenarios that would most challenge the nation's capability to respond. And then the capability targets that we would need to respond are based on those scenarios. So the risk in the NRCA is that capability gap that you can see highlighted over there, the dotted lines and the gray there. And the risk mitigations that are being undertaken, sort of the concrete steps to address those risks, are what is being done within each capability, within each specialty, to close those capability gaps. And if anybody's curious, the top 7 scenarios, and you can Google this. This is out on FEMA's website if anyone's curious about. If you just Google FEMA THIRA or NRCA, the 2019 plan will come up, and I think it's in Appendix B. So the 7 scenarios that they focused on were either a concurrent or consecutive Cascadia San Andreas fault earthquake scenario, a New Madrid earthquake scenario, Texas flooding and hurricane, Florida flooding, sorry, I don't know what words those were, Florida hurricane, Hawaii hurricane, a pandemic, and a space weather scenario. So interesting that in 2019, one of the 7 key scenarios was a pandemic. I don't recall the publication date on the NRCA, but it's kind of it's always been something that the community has planned for or tried to plan for, but obviously we've met some capability gaps sooner than we ever hoped we would on that. Any questions on the physical side before I dive into, kind of the last 6 years of my life? All right, hearing none. So in my bio, we mentioned that joined DOJ in 2015. I've always kind of had a foot in both ponds, IT security and emergency management or physical security. But really the last 6 years I have been, I started out as the continuity planner for the business, the office of the OCIO. In order to do that job, we identified mission essential functions that the entire department relies on, that we host, manage, support, things like that. So we have identified those mission essential functions, and one of the key jobs was to work with the system owners and the business owners to improve the resiliency of those information systems. After a couple of years doing that, they needed help with their annual FISMA audits. So I got sucked down into IT's audit, cybersecurity audit world. And obviously the last year and a half has been particularly busy in incident response. It turned out that writing a good plan meant that I got asked to help write many other plans. And one of the jobs that my staff is responsible for is maintaining that departmental cybersecurity implementation guidance that we pass out to the components. So a lot of our work is seated in the NIST risk management framework. So NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, for those who might not be familiar. There are, as you can see in this graphic here, there are any number of NIST special publications that refer back to federal information processing standards. There's a whole lot of federal guidance out there about how to appropriately assess, secure, monitor information systems. I'm not going to go super deep on that. That's probably a minor in and of itself at this point. I don't know if you could even cover it in the 3-credit class, but broadly, very broadly, the RMF, it intends to try and put information security at the table with a broader risk management discussion, right? It doesn't prescribe a framework for the organization to conduct risk management in, but it talks to some extent about how cybersecurity should be included in that organizational risk management framework. In a lot of cases, what I have found practically is that it's up to the cybersecurity staff or the cybersecurity management to go find those organizational leaders, those enterprise risk managers, if you're not already at the table, and advocate for your own seat at the table, right? I won't mention names, but I was at one of these conferences a couple of years ago, and there was a company that had a global supply network, and they had been hit by the NotPetya attacks because one of their suppliers was based in the Ukraine. So through their supplier, they got the NotPetya malware, bricked their supplier's systems. Somehow or another that interfaced with corporate systems, and they had this propagating malware rampaging through their network. And they said, they were shocked. They didn't fully understand the supply chain risk. They didn't fully understand the cybersecurity risk that could be kind of visited upon them, through their integrated networks with their suppliers, with their networks. And it was an amazing presentation because it was probably 2017 at that point. And one of their after actions was that they were conducting an assessment and authorization of their information systems based on the NIST security controls, FIPS and NIST. And my mind was just blown, maybe that's because I'm in it and I'm living it day to day, but I'm thinking, man, it's 2017 and you haven't, this is a multinational corporation, and they had not yet formalized their kind of risk management approach on the IT side. They had SOCs, they had NOCs, they were monitoring traffic, they were checking email, they were doing all kinds of good things from a security perspective, but they hadn't done this kind of initial foundational risk assessment piece, right? So those of you who know this won't be new to you, but the RMF looks primarily at an information security lens, but more and more integrating privacy protections, integrating those into how we build, how we design, how we implement information systems. And the intent is to start this at the design phase. And that means essentially whenever somebody in the C-suite says, I have a great idea for an information system, we have to stop as cybersecurity professionals and say, okay, hold on. What types of information is this system going to process? Who's going to have access to it? What is the intent of this? And then we go through the assessment authorization phase and figure out, what is this system going to do? And then the rest of the RMF, maintaining an awareness of those security controls and briefing out that information to senior leadership. So I already kind of covered a little bit of this, but I just wanted to put the risk management framework and the cybersecurity functions from the cybersecurity framework here kind of side by side. Both of these are critical, at least in our shop. From a policy, from a compliance standpoint, all of our information systems in DOJ have to go through an authorization process. It's written in our highest level policy that you can't implement an information system. There shall be no IT that can store, process, transmit, a couple other verbs, DOJ information without an authority to operate or an ATO. And that's the RMF process. This prepare step, RMF still talks about a 6-step process, but you'll see that there are 7 bullets there. This prepare step is considered step 0. And this is new in their Rev 2 that they recently published. The prepare step addresses kind of those risk management pieces at the organization or the mission or the business process level to help prepare the organization to manage security and privacy risks. So is there a process in place to get ATOs? Is there a requirement that all information systems must be authorized? If the information system is going to handle privacy data, is there a requirement to have a privacy impact assessment completed, right? You know, a lot of this is federal speak, so I do apologize for that. That's kind of my background. But that's the prepare step in the RMF. And then the rest of it is kind of what I just went through. Categorize the information system based on the types of information that'll be processed. This generally will result in a low, moderate, high designation. You'll be, you know, this is one of the things you'll see across risk disciplines is we try and assess risk on a stoplight chart or a color gradient, green to red, or a low, moderate, high, or, you know, maybe a 1 to 5 scale, but it's all that kind of same sliding scale, right? Once it's categorized, we can select an initial security baseline to apply. And there may be some things that we need to adjust on that baseline, right? If it's going to be considered a high value asset, there are additional controls that we might need to apply to it. If it's going to process federal taxpayer information, there are special controls, access controls, encryption requirements, things like that that we may have to apply. So once you have that low, moderate, high designation, there may be some additional work that you'll have to do as far as selecting the security baseline that you have to implement based on, again, the types of the information that that system is going to process and the mission that it's going to support. Implement and assess kind of go hand in hand. You implement those security controls from a technical standpoint. You assess the effectiveness of that implementation kind of from a third-party audit perspective. So those of you who aren't familiar with IT, you've got your engineers and you've got your security officers, or you've got your control assessors. A lot of times the security officer is the control assessor, at least in the federal space. So that's implement from a technical standpoint, assess effectiveness. You get that ATO phase. That is the formal acceptance. That's the formal acceptance within the organization of the risk carried with that information system. And then monitor is the ongoing operations, maintenance of that system. And depending on the maturity of your organization, monitor could mean any number of things, right? We have a requirement within my organization to go through and hit, I think it's about 60 controls from the NIST framework. Depending on your information system, it may be more, it may be less, but we have a core controls requirement that the ISO, the security officer, is supposed to go back through and reassess those core controls on an annual basis. But we also have scanning requirements. We have configuration management requirements. We have incident reporting requirements. All of that kind of feeds into the monitor phase. Now that is on a system by system level, how we assess risk to information that will be processed or stored or transmitted. At an organizational level, we have kind of the cybersecurity functions. And for anybody who's gone through an information security audit, these will look familiar to you. These always show up on the FISMA audit. FISMA is the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014. Originally, it stood for Management Act. That was 2002. The update to the law in 2014 added a couple of different requirements and bolstered the auditing. So every year, whether we like it or not, a couple dozen of our information systems get audited. Our Office of the Inspector General brings in some contract support, and they go through and they assess our enterprise program and our individual information systems implementation of the cybersecurity functions, how you identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover from cybersecurity threats or incidents. There's a good NIST publication, IR 8286. I think it actually just came out in December on the integration of cybersecurity into enterprise risk management. So I'm talking about it kind of at a high level here. NIST has been working on this for about a year and a half now. So they have their own, a whole publication of their own now to talk about how to integrate, some of these cybersecurity concepts into enterprise risk management. Folks are starting to move away from the system development lifecycle, mostly because on the IT side, we're trying to be more agile. We're trying to be more virtualized. The SDLC was a little bit more of a server physical hardware based approach. Not to say that it doesn't still apply, but some folks get a little skittish when you talk about the SDLC now. They'd rather hear about secure DevOps or SecDevOps or, waterfall approaches and agile development, things like that. But I just wanted to include this in here as kind of a visual representation of how the RMF flows through the development, the integration, implementation of an information system. Now, why is all that important? All that's important because at the end of the day, no matter what organization or what business you're in, your information is increasingly virtualized. We're doing this presentation via Zoom meeting. I use another example from a conference. One of the major American cities that recently got ransomwared, and there have been a couple, so this isn't necessarily one or the other. But I was at a conference also in 2017, and they were talking about how the police officers in the car, when they write you their ticket, most of the time now that ticket is pre-printed. There's an online system in the car that's networked back to their databases. And so, when they put that system online, they had to go through this process. They had to think about, well, what kind of data is going to be involved in that? How am I going to populate that ticket? I'm going to make a call to a database. I'll get this person's warrant information. I'll make a call to the FBI database, Criminal Justice Information Services from the FBI. I'll see if they have a record. I'll see if they have any, arrest history. Is this person potentially violent? Do I need to prepare for that? They'll call back to the motor vehicle database, get information on whether or not your license and registration are current. They'll check your insurance records. Are you insured, right? All of that stuff was being populated into the ticket automatically. And this city went down hard with a ransomware attack. And the city manager did a briefing at one of these conferences talking about how they had to do remedial ticket writing training at shift change for the officers on highway patrol, because they had to go back to, white, green, yellow, or white, green, pink, and talk to them about, you call back to the office, and this is how we populate this, and this is the version that you keep. This is the one you give to the driver. This is the one you bring back, and we file with the courthouse. So this is something that lives in the information technology space, but it's not something that is just in IT, right? The information that's housed here is ballooning rapidly all around us, and the potential impact of a compromise to that information can have really serious cascading consequences. So I'm going to pause there and just see, are there any questions on the RMF cybersecurity framework?
We don't have anything posted yet, Eliot. Just
Okay.
give you a warning, you're at 15 minutes till 6.
Oh, okay. All right. So all of that to say, I think we've talked through some fairly significant examples of this concept of convergence or intersectionality, where cyber, in this graphic, it's the bottom right-hand corner, but all different business lines have risk input into enterprise risk management. And it's just going to depend on, like we talked about at the beginning, the scope of the enterprise as to how that's handled. Another document recently released, actually since I first ran into this group at the IAEM conference, the Federal Mission Resilience Strategy was just published in December of 2020. And the priority action from the FMRS is to advance a holistic risk management approach across federal departments and agencies. And so there's a recognition, at least at the federal level, that various risk management methodologies exist. And each one of them has kind of come up with its own taxonomy, its own verbiage, its own requirements or resources to identify gaps and integrate risk management into the organization. And so this is a federal emergency management continuity directive, is to break down those silos and ensure that we can talk across disciplines and effectively integrate kind of a holistic version of risk management. It's essentially the whole of community approach that was applied to response is now being applied to risk management. You know, you need to seek input from the financial sector, from physical security, from information security, from human resources, and get them all pulled in and a seat at the table together. So there are a couple of things from the cyber side. There are a couple of different things that can be tracked, that can be integrated into that broader risk management framework. I just want to hit on some high-level metrics, and then we'll kind of go into how those metrics can be tracked and how those metrics can be integrated. So you have basic compliance metrics, status and health of your authorities to operate. If your information systems require an ATO, do you have them? Are any about to expire? Are there any expiring ATOs on your high value assets or your crown jewels within your organization? Those are probably, you're going to want to prioritize those. It's important to note that whenever you authorize a system, you don't necessarily have to pass every control. I don't remember how many hundreds of lines there are in NIST 853. But you don't have to, get green on every single one of those. If there's a control failure, you're supposed to open a plan of action and milestones and identify mitigation strategies that can be applied. When you present those POAMs, we call them POAMs, plans of action, milestones, to your authorizing official is at the level to approve or deny that request. It'll be up to he or she to say, yes, I'm comfortable with that level of risk. I feel like appropriate mitigations have been taken. So tracking ATOs, tracking POAMs, you can track supported or unsupported software. So Windows 7 went end of life a year and a half ago or so. Everybody was probably aware that Flash was deprecated at the end of last year. So Flash is now unsupported. You have the same thing with hardware. You don't want old printers or scanners, or this comes up more in industrial control systems. Old technologies that weren't designed to be networked might not be capable of supporting appropriate hardening measures, right? So those are things that you can track. Over and above whether or not the hardware and the software is still within support, there's patching compliance, vulnerability scanning. We require scanning in my organization. We require scanning on a monthly basis. So it should be running at least every 30 days, if not more frequently, against the security technical implementation guides, the DISA STIGs. There are other baselines that can be scanned against. And it's important to note that vulnerabilities can exist on multiple levels of an information system. So you could have vulnerabilities on the Windows operating system. You could have vulnerabilities on the Zoom application. You could have vulnerabilities on an underlying database that might be accessible through either the web app or the operating system. So we require scanning on at least all three of those layers within the information security environment. Another one there, access and authentication rules. So what's the user base for this system? How many people have access to it? How many people have access to manipulate the data, right? So that's privileged access. How many people have access to the back end? And how is that access managed and monitored? Another one that's coming up, since so much ransomware is getting passed around in email, good phishing statistics, phishing training. And audit findings. I don't have that listed on the slide, but audit findings and remediation of audit findings, since that's something we do a whole heck of a lot of. So depending on how mature the organization is, you might have some of these inputs tracked. We're kind of in I've recently become aware of the concept of the Ouroboros, the snake that eats its tail. I feel like that's kind of where we are with cybersecurity at this point, because we're using IT tools to track and remediate IT vulnerabilities. And you guys may have heard of a little hack that occurred recently where a cybersecurity tool was the attack vector that was used, right? So there is some inherent risk in using all IT products. So you have scanners, you have governance risk compliance tools, you have identity warehouses, privileged access managers. There are any number of tools that may be in place within an organization. And the trick is here for the enterprise risk management piece, getting that data out of those tools and aggregating it or displaying it in a certain type of level. So here's one example. This is tracking inputs for vulnerability management, for configuration management, and for software risk. So the inputs from the various scanning tools are thrown into the security information and event manager in this case, the SIEM tool, right? So all of these various tools that do the work feed into a tool that aggregates the work, feeds into a tool that displays the work, right? And that's what we're looking at a snapshot of here. So scan tool inputs, compliance inputs, software version patching inputs all come in here. And then you get this kind of overall risk assessment goes from, let's say 0 to 100. And in this case, it's a 24. Now, here's the meat of it, right? Is integrating those IT metrics into enterprise risk management. And again, this is not trying to be specific or prescribe a best way to do this. So I've been in fairly large organizations where the risk management process is a risk register. It's a SharePoint list, and we bring the principals around a conference table once a month, and we review the SharePoint list. So if that's how risk management is being tracked in your organization, it's important to make sure you have a cyber tag and determine what level of information to include for those cyber risks. I've kind of got the triangle, the hierarchy over on the end there of what, the principals at various levels might want to keep track of. I've been part of an effort lately talking about kind of a health metric scoring. So, for certain investments or certain programs, we kind of score we had been scoring their program management health on a 1 to 100, kind of an academic, A, B, C, that kind of thing. And what we've been trying to do lately is incorporate a cyber score into that overall program health. So we started out, we thought, okay, let's give cyber 15 points out of 100 here. Obviously, you could do more, you could do less. That's within your organization. And then we had to figure out which metrics within cyber we wanted to score and how we wanted to address those scores. And what I've done here is I've picked some numbers at random. This isn't representative of any particular program or investment, but just to say, this is a way that you could kind of visualize quantitatively integrating cyber into an enterprise risk management score. So in this one, just quickly, I've ranked ATOs. We've been talking about a way in which we base the ATO assessment on the number of controls that were failed while we were doing the assessment. We know the average number of failed controls across all the systems within the organization, and we can down select that to specific components, business lines, divisions, things like that. So we assess this system against its peers, and we try and give it, a representative average. If the system beats the average, it gets a full 5 points. If it fares worse, but within one standard deviation, it gets 3 points. If it fares worse, but outside of a standard deviation, we give it 1. We've done something similar on the vulnerability side of the house here. And with plans of actions and milestones, we've gotten a little more detailed. So for this one, we've said if it's remediated all of its open POAMs in the last 12 months, it gets 5. If it still has open POAMs, but none are delayed, it'll get a 4. If it has open POAMs, but less than half are delayed, we'll give it a 3. Open POAMs more than half delayed, we'll give it a 2. Open POAMs all delayed, we give it a 1. And really quickly, what does that mean if a POAM is delayed? That means that essentially we've missed our initial targets. We had a plan, we had milestones, we whiffed, we didn't make it. It could be a staff shortage, it could be a funding shortage, it could be a technology dependency. Something has caused us not to be able to remediate that vulnerability. And so that's why we score kind of delayed POAMs the way we do. So that's one example there. And then my last slide is just other resources to track down some of these frameworks. So I'm going to stop the share here and check the chat and see what we've got going on in the chat.
Yeah, I encourage participants to drop some questions on the chat, and you have a couple of them. And while JJ is asking if he could be given mic rights to verbally pose this question because he thinks that's easier. May I suggest you start with what's on the chat and can just be replied to directly, and then before we conclude, we'll call JJ or anybody else who'd like to rather.
Yeah, I love a good scenario.
Okay, Elliot, I'd like to, if we could first though, start with Griffin's question, since he did ask that earlier.
Oh yeah, that's right. There. So the question that came in earlier was about the increased use of telemedicine and telehealth. This is a particularly timely question. Let's see. So cybersecurity risk for telehealth. In most cases, I think the providers are using some type of a virtual desktop, or they're using a meeting platform like Zoom in order to conduct their appointments. But the risk that you want to probably assess in this case would be whether or not protected health information or personally identifiable information could be shared across this platform. On the cyber side specifically, you want to make sure that, you know, the tunnel is encrypted, the call itself is encrypted, so that, you know, you don't have any kind of man in the middle attacks. If you know, in this case, you're going broad, right? We could be talking to any client or any patient of that doctor. You have no idea what the cybersecurity status of that person's phone, tablet, computer might be, right? If you're calling my dad, God help you. You want to make sure that he does not have access as a customer back to your system or application. So you want, in this case, I think the customer to have read-only access, and you want to make sure. So there's access control questions. There's kind of encryption or identity protection issues, and the transmission of PII and PHI.
Yeah. I was gonna say thank you. And I guess the application that I had in mind was, as specifically say for my company, as we've tried to say start to use the ability to leverage, say, like hypothetically doing ultrasound scans in the field and being able to get say input from, say, like a central team and say the risks there. But I think you addressed it. Thanks.
Well, I think that's something that some of the bigger diagnostic firms have already done. Before the pandemic, I heard a lot about imagery analysts, healthcare imagery analysts being employed in a telework capacity, where the image might be taken at a diagnostic site here, but then it's sent or it's uploaded for an analyst to review, you know, I don't know, Omaha, Nebraska, somewhere. And then those results are ultimately sent back to the provider. I know I had that kind of had to chase that down myself, where my doctor got the analysis, but had to go request the scans to look at them herself, right? So depends on, you know, in that case, you would consider the scans themselves, the database of those scans, probably to be a high value asset. So again, you have access control questions from the user standpoint, as well as from the cybersecurity sysadmin standpoint, right? You don't want just anybody to be able to go in there and manipulate the scan data, right?
Okay, thank you. As we have it's 6 o'clock, but I think we can do a few minutes over, and we have 2 open questions, I believe. One is from Leah, who is posting under the account name of Thea Smith. And maybe Alison, you could read that one out, and then Eliot, you could respond. And then after that, before we conclude, we can give JJ the floor to ask his question directly.
Sure. So the question from Thea was, how do you balance efforts to protect against the risk posed by a cyber incursion into a virtual organization system and the human component, oh yes, that underpins acts of aggression against a given organization or company? Yes, the insider threat piece. So insider threat is kind of a point of convergence within points of convergence, right? So the insider threat teams, generally, they're looking at various indicators. Could be personnel security, physical security, cybersecurity, the monitoring, the establishment of a activity baseline, and then looking for any deviations from that baseline is one of the things that an insider threat analyst on the cyber side would do. So if I understand this question correctly, I mean, this is a tricky one, right? It's about the organization's risk tolerance fundamentally, right? The risk of cyber incursion against that human component.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this is, it is tricky. You really need to have kind of an interdisciplinary approach to the insider threat office, over and above an interdisciplinary approach to enterprise risk management. You know, generally, and you can find case studies on insider threats, just a quick Google or look at the FBI case files. And in most cases, it was an evolution on the part of the individual. So there were indicators that were missed along the way. Financial problems, home life problems, work life problems, culture issues, you know. So when you're looking at kind of the human aspect of it, that insider threat piece is one of the trickiest ones that we have to deal with from a cyber perspective. There are also inadvertent, I guess, unintentional kind of insiders. So the person that gets spearphished with ransomware does not intend to bring your organization down. So there are things that you can do to bring the entire workforce up a level in terms of their cyber resilience. Phishing training is a great one. We require phishing training on a quarterly basis. So there, you know, you can always do that, but that, you know, aggrieved insider is a particularly tricky nut to crack.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your response.
Sure. All right.
Okay,
Before JJ gets on,
it's your turn, right? JJ?
I just want to say before
Yeah.
JJ gets on, if Eliot, I don't know if you can share your email in the chat.
Absolutely.
If not, if you need to leave, please send me your questions at ags28@psu.edu.
Yeah, and Alison left her email address also on the chat. So JJ, with that, then it's your turn.
I'll try to make this quick, Eliot. Thank you.
Sure.
So from the insider threat and the risk management perspective, I spent some time in casino security, and that's a whole world in itself in an isolated area in the private sector. Now I work in the public sector, and it's amazing that what I can do and not do out of my basement with, you know, over a VPN in the public sector point of view. But I guess, you know, how the amount of damage that I could hypothetically do because I'm an insider with the VPN, as far as across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania with access to surveillance cameras and message boards on interstates and things like that. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Because from my experience, it seems like the private sector, maybe it's because it's the physical part, but they seem further ahead than the public sector, or maybe am I missing layers of security, or you have any thoughts on that?
I do have some thoughts on that. I don't know if you're necessarily missing anything. It sounds like very thorough and astute observation on your part. There are a couple of different layers, right? So I would say there's a high value asset component to it, and there's a privileged user component to it, and both of those need to be looked at in terms of how we would secure or potentially try and prevent an insider's access, right? The worst, so one of the things that my boss hates the concept of privileged users, right? He has told us any number of times that he wants to get rid of privileged user roles as a role that you can have, just in general. What he wants to do is go for that zero trust network design and just-in-time privileged escalation. That is really hard to do in my organization. I don't know how we see it is in other organizations that were built on old frameworks and older technologies. I think it's something that we'll be able to get to in the decade, or at least see a lot more of in the next decade. But the way that you kind of mitigate the risk of an insider, somebody with that God level access or privileged user who has that level of access, is you validate their activity on each instance, right? So I talked about activity monitoring to set a baseline. In a lot of cases, unfortunately, the activity monitoring is a passive thing, and you get alerted when there were spikes or abnormalities in the activity monitoring. A zero trust network gives you the opportunity to validate that activity. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to make a change just because you were a privileged user. You would need to have both, a privileged user role and an approved change request, right, in order to make that change. So, again, we could probably do a whole webinar on zero trust networking, but that at a high level, there's kind of two different aspects to go at it from: the network security piece and the account management piece.
Thank you.
Sure.
Richard has his hand up, so I don't know if Richard
Yep.
has another question or a comment. Go ahead, Richard.
It was just a comment on the zero trust.
Yeah.
Recently, where I work, we implemented a change to our identity management where through Azure, we've turned on Penn, the privileged identity management. And it's interesting because it's kind of a pain in the ass, because as an admin, a sysadmin, I got to go in and got to go turn things on. And there's not a whole lot that, as long as I see only the roles that I'm given, and then I just activate it, I put in a quick, hey, I'm doing admin work.
Right.
And then turn it on, wait for it. And it makes sense, but at the same time, when I can still go in and turn these things on. But the interesting part too is when it comes to Microsoft, I'm sure other applications, you may not always turn on all the things that you need in order to do one thing.
Right.
So I can turn on one administrator role, but I actually need two. But they don't like to tell you that you need two. So,
and in some cases that's intentional. There was some open source reporting that after some of the breaches that occurred in 2016, 2017, all the disclosures of classified information, there was some fear that the entire federal sector was going to go to two-person, two-person integrity for privileged user actions. I don't think we did. It's some cases that is a requirement, but not across the board. But that's another thing that could be looked at potentially for privileged users on high value assets or crown jewel type systems, that you always have two people, one to implement and one to authenticate. It's kind of like the turning the keys in the submarine in the movies, right? So. Yeah, there's a lot, there's a lot to unpack across all the disciplines. I know I threw a lot of information at you guys, and each one of these, you saw the graphic from the NIST framework. Talk about the RMF. The RMF sits on a dozen other documents in and of itself, and the facility security levels and everything. I went to a week-long FEMA course on building design for counterterrorism security. So each one of these disciplines is a whole 3-credit course in and of itself. And then to get to the C-suite level or the executive level and get them to be able to talk across each other, use the same language, the same frameworks, the same ranking scheme, right? And what is, what is a cybersecurity incident versus, financial loss or reputational loss or damage from a hurricane, for example, that's a tricky conversation to have.
Thanks again, Eliot. That's been great. That's been a great start, a kickoff of our series. We'll also be sending you a little certificate of appreciation.
Oh, thank you.
So watch out for that. And thank you, Alison, for organizing this, for running the show. And also, thanks for coming, everybody. This is the first event in the series. I mentioned that before. I said that a number of times. But you have in the chat, you also have the link to the currently scheduled next events in the series. So please check it out if you care to attend. It would be great to have you again. Just remember to register for each single event under the link provided. And with that, Eliot, thanks again. That's been very insightful. That's great.
Thank you all.
Enjoy
Thank you
your
for having me.
president. Great. Thank you.